I'm very pleased this afternoon to introduce once again Paul Palmer, who is one of our Leicestershire moth experts. This afternoon, Paul's going to talk specifically about the dark swordgrass, an interesting moth. And when he's run through that, I'm sure there'll be some time left over for questions and general discussion and anything that anybody else wants to raise. So, Paul, if I hand over to you now, let's hear about the dark swordgrass, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, the dark swordgrass moth. I decided when I first asked to do these series to pick on particular moths, and as ever, I'm picking on a fairly common moth, but sometimes it can be challenging to identify. Now, what I'm going to do is play a recording of the slideshow again, so complete with my ums, ers and buts. I did it all in one session, but it does mean doing it this way. If we have a problem with the recording, we can always insert a clean video recording and make a presentation as it should have been. So I'm going to now share the screen. And then here we are, a picture of the dark swordgrass. Now, hopefully this is going to work. I'm going to play the recorded slide show. So please don't interrupt while the recording is speaking, because it won't make any difference at all. Is it going to work? Oh, here we are. Hello, today we're going to have a look at the dark swordgrass moth. Once again, I'm using a set specimen because it's a lot easier to look at the distinguishing features on a set specimen than it is a live moth. But this is a moth that you can identify without the need to take a specimen. Now, it's a migrant, so it can be found in almost any month of the year. On the continent, apparently it doesn't like the frost, so warming the climate may extend its breeding range and flight time, which again means it's a moth to keep your eyes open for. It's a large moth, and once again I always emphasize the need to check the size of the moth, because it's a feature you can be rarely certain of, and it's very easy to determine. So with a forewing length of this specimen of 20 millimeters, 20.3 millimeters, the set wingspan is just a little bit underneath 50 millimeters. That puts it right up near the size of a large yellow underwing. Indeed, you might even think at first sight maybe this is a large yellow underwing, but of course on the set specimen we can easily see that it hasn't got yellow hindwings. Now, on the live moth, if you're not sure, you can use a pencil just to gently lift the wing up so that you can check the hindwing. So here we can see that the hindwing is a kind of dirty brown. It's certainly not glossy white. And the reason I say that is that maybe one of the other confusion species is the pearly underwing. I nearly said mother of pearl moth. The pearly underwing, which is very similar in size. However, the pearly underwing has a very prominent grey crest down the thorax. That's where the pin is in this moth. Now, in this moth, it's very, very subtly marked. So we can see that it lacks the reniform stigmata, which is circled in red here, that you would expect if you're looking at a turnip moth. You can just see a little black marking, but there's certainly no dark mark here. A little further down the wing, there is a couple of black darts, but again this specimen is quite interesting because these marks aren't terribly obvious. And finally, towards the outside of the wing, there is the sort of ghost of a series of darts. Now, in many specimens of this moth, these are actually very, very black, so it's a series of black darts. And this kind of emphasises one of the things that I always say, is that you need to look really closely at even macro moths and use a hand lens, because even in specimens like this, where the markings are very obscure, this is often termed obsolete, you can actually see the ghost of the marks. If you take a photograph with a flash gun, I use a ring flash, again these very obscure markings can become much more easily visible. Something else to look at are the antennae. Now, according to the book, the antennae are said to be strongly bipectinate, and this means feathery on both sides. In actual fact, all the specimens I've ever seen, indeed the specimen that's advertising this particular talk, the antennae are pectinate, that is, they've got feathery only on one side. But here on this moth, the antennae are clearly very simple. That means they're just very whip-like. And that is suggestive that this moth is a female. And we'll have a look at that in a moment. Something else to look at as well is the collar on the head of the thorax. Now, in these sorts of moths, the darts, this is often very distinctive. And if we look at this head on, we will see that there's a series of bands, and that's very distinctive in this particular species of moth, this series of bands. So again, when you look at the moth head on, you can immediately tell it apart from all the other darts and things like heart and dart. They've got a single solid black collar. The large yellow underwing, of course, hasn't got any markings here at all, nor has the pearly underwing. So this is a very good feature to use. And I said that we'd have a look at whether this is a female moth. And one of the distinctive features of moths is the frenulum and reticulatum, which is the mechanism that links the two wings together. Now, in the males, this is a single bristle, so the frenulum is a single bristle. In the female, it's always multiple bristles, usually 3. And in this particular case, if we look really closely, we can see that there are indeed 3 bristles and a little very hook mechanism into which the bristles, one of the bristles has engaged. So this moth is definitely a female. Finally, while we're looking at the underside of the moth, we can see that on the underside of the forewing, in this particular case, there's very few distinguishing features. There's no obvious stigmata or spots or crossbands, so there's nothing really useful for identifying the moth in this particular case. And this same can really be said of the underside of the hindwing. It's not that different from the upper side. So if we recap, we can see what the features are that we use to identify the dark swordgrass. The most important was the size, because that really restricts the number of possible moths down. And then we could see the various stigmata on the forewing. So there's the lack of a dart, and then there's the 2 little darts, and then finally on the outer edge of the wing there's a series of darts. And if we have a look at the hind wing, it's a dirty brown. And as I said before, a really good feature is the head of the thorax, which is banded. The antenna in this case were simple antennae, which indicated that the moth was likely to be a female, and we proved that by looking at the frenulum and reticulatum on the underside of the moth. So that's it. That's how you use multiple features to identify the dark swordgrass when you come across it. And remember, you may be able to come across this moth in your moth trap at almost any time of the year. So there you go, the dark swordgrass moth. I did a little bit of research to find if I could find any specimens that looked just like this one, which, as I say, was quite unusual because it lacks the obvious black darts that are mentioned in the field guides. And I did find an example that was identical on the German Lepiforum website. So it's not a named form of the moth, but it's certainly out there, and other people are finding this moth. Anyway, that was, to me, that was quite an interesting one. I've already recorded the dark swordgrass, I think, once this year. So I hope you're lucky enough to get one in your trap as well. Well, that's it for that. Any questions?
So I guess the other thing to say is that since this is, so I believe, is this still true, Paul? There's no evidence that it actually breeds in this country.
According to the book, that's true. Its breeding habits are not well known. I think the main thing that's known about it is that it doesn't like the frost. So that's why I made the comment that with changing climate, it may change. So comments that were made maybe 10 years ago may not still apply to today. So I think one's got to be a little bit careful about that.
But nevertheless, it's essentially a migratory moth. They're going to be coming north. So presumably then numbers will vary considerably from year to year.
Yeah, I would need to check, but I seem to have come across it most years, and certainly that little record, the phenology chart, which comes from Adrian's data, suggests that it's pretty regularly seen. So it's not one of these scarce migrants. Because of its size, there's very few things that you can confuse it with. One of the colour forms of the large yellow underwing might be confused with it. I think if you're familiar with the shape, you probably wouldn't make that mistake. But if you're a beginner, and there's a lot of new people coming to the field these days, I think they might be able to lose it amongst large yellow underwings. Certainly, if you had 20 or 30 large yellow underwings in the trap, you might lose it amongst those.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I've never recorded it in my garden, although my Leicester garden gets quite a restricted range of species. We don't get anything like the range of species that you get, for example. But I do wonder whether I might not have missed one or two specimens amongst the large yellow underwings, the time of year when you get blitz with large yellow underwings, and stop looking at them quite so closely, maybe because you've got so many and so much else in the trap. It's possible I may have missed one.
Yeah, and I would say equally so. It could be possible to lose a pearly underwing for the same reason. But again, there's always a pattern to the way that I say to identify things, and it's always size first, because you can be really, really certain of size. Unfortunately, we have very few good keys for moths, but if we were to have one of these multi-access keys where you could enter the size, the moment you put the size, that dramatically reduces the number of possible moths. So of course, I'm doing this in my head. And then the pearly underwing, well, the grey crest is actually quite distinctive, but even better test is that if you're actually looking at your moth trap in the morning, so all the moths are docile, you use the pencil just to peek at the hind wing, and then straight away the three confusion species are clearly differentiated by the colour of the hind wing. So you only need a tiny little peak. I think the other thing I would say is that when I'm doing the moth trap in the morning, at the moment I'm getting up and usually out in the garden about 5 o'clock. Then I go back to bed and sleep for a bit longer. Anything that I'm not sure about, anything that even looks the slightest bit odd, gets popped in a pot. That goes in a bag which goes in the fridge. And then usually about this time of day, I'll have a look about what's in the pot. And often I've thought, oh, that's only a common thing. But when I've looked, when I've been wide awake, that's when I found, oh, I'm really pleased I potted that. That wasn't what I expected it to be through my rather sleepy eyes. So again, the habit to get into is that when you're doing your moth trap, if you see anything, well, if it turned out to be just a funny looking large yellow underwing, but don't tell anybody, just put it down as a large yellow underwing. But if you're lucky enough to have found a dark swordgrass, then good for you. You know, you got it on the second look.
Very good. Okay. Has anyone else got any questions or want to ask anything? You're thinking about it.
Yes. Just while people are thinking, one of the pairs of moths that you asked me to do something on was the uncertain and the rustic. I have actually just taken off the setting board a pair of fresh specimens of both taken this year, because my previous specimens were taken in 1980 something. So they're a little bit old, not very, you know, they faded a little bit over the years. But I have got a pair now of uncertain and rustic to really to do as a pair of moths together, which I suspect might be of interest to people.
Well, it's certainly of interest to me, yeah, and other people as well. It's my bête noire, that the uncertain, I'm afraid, yeah. Can we pencil that in for next month, maybe?
I think we can probably pencil that one in. I said I took it off the setting board and made sure that I had one of each. It would be very embarrassing to get to the point and realise I didn't. But at this time,
especially when we put it on YouTube.
Yeah. I said to Leslie, you know, I worry a little bit about talking about the uncertain and the rustic because it's bound to be controversial. But you know, to be honest with you, I mean, at the moment, if you were to just guess, oh, they're all uncertains, you wouldn't be far wrong. It's mainly uncertain in the moth trap at the moment. And then because the rustics are always slightly later on the wing, and then towards the end of the season, the uncertains come back again. And it's kind of in the somewhere in the middle that you get the mix of both of them. But you can do most by eye, and dissecting is a waste of time. Yeah.
Again, in Leicester, in the city, or on the edge of the city, I see very few uncertains. Whenever I think I've found an uncertain and I run it past Adrian, he says no. So for me, it's just, you know, a peak of rustics, and that's pretty much it. We just don't seem to get many uncertains here at all. I don't know what the reason for that is, other than just the restricted range of species. But anyway, we're getting into next month's topic. We should stop talking about that and talk about this.
Yeah. So any questions about the dark swordgrass, or indeed any of the sort of related dart species at all?
Can I ask us to, I don't know much about moths, to be fair, but can I kindly ask you about where would I expect, what sort of plants or environment do they like to be in? Do you know at all?
I'm just going to look that up to see what the book says, rather than say something
Thank you.
Outrageous. Here we are. So according to the field guide, it's it's a general herbaceous plants feeding near ground level and rarely reported. It accepts dandelion and plantains in captivity. Well, if you try to rear caterpillars that you find, from moth's eggs, when you don't know the species, the things that you always try them on are ivy, dandelion, and plantain. So, because quite a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be found in them in the wild will take those. So that's why it says accepts dandelion and plantains in captivity. And also, when you're trying to rear caterpillars, sometimes the species, they like the leaves to be a little withered. That's not dried out, but just a little withered. So, as Alan said, it's one of those moths. I don't think a huge amount is known about the breeding of it in this country. And it says, the guide here says, breeding in this country is unconfirmed.
If you read the Wikipedia entry, and I know that's a controversial thing, that may not be terribly popular with everyone. It's based on North America, because this is a moth with a global distribution. The thing about the North American thing is it's treated very much as an agricultural pest in North America, as I suspect a lot of insects are. There's something on there about the breeding, but it does seem to be quite conjectural. It doesn't seem to be very clear cut. Just going back to what Poran asked, I mean, given that this is a moth that migrates hundreds, if not thousands of miles, where the adults could turn up would be effectively anywhere. Because obviously if it's flying thousands of miles and it happens to go past a moth trap, it's liable to wind up in it. So,
Yeah. I mean, I've never had numbers of them in the trap. I mean, I can't be 100% accurate without going through years worth of records, but my recollection is only finding them in singletons in the trap, never in numbers. And very much the same goes for the pearly underwing as well. It's irregular in the trap, probably get them most years, but never in numbers. And for people who've never been mothing before, we mentioned the large yellow underwing. Well, when I was a lad, in fact, when I moved into this area 40 years ago, when you open the moth trap, sort of Robinson type moth trap, you might get 200 or 300 large yellow underwings, and then you'd be rummaging amongst the large yellow underwings to find the other interesting species. The large yellow underwing population collapsed, and it's never really returned to its former numbers. And I suspect that we lost quite a lot of moths in amongst the large yellow underwing. It would have been harder to spot this moth amongst 200 large yellow underwing. You just, oh yeah, there's another large yellow underwing, and not look at it.
Going back to what we were talking about earlier, before we started the recording, when we were talking about Microscope Club, when I was talking about lighting, one of the options I saw from Brunel microscopes is that they also do a whole range of UV lights. I'm wondering about some of these moths, all of these brown moths, all of the darts, all of the noctilids, whether there's any mileage looking at them under UV, whether there's any UV markings that might appear that don't appear in daylight. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever done that. I mean, even thinking about those banknote detectors, those handheld banknote detectors. Have you ever tried that, Paul?
Yeah, I have. Look, I've got a couple of UV bulbs that somebody sent me here. Yeah, I've tried doing that on some moths. The only ones that I found that seem to have anything slightly even remotely fluorescent are moths with yellow markings on. Particularly thinking of things like the brimstone moth, but doesn't seem to be anything dramatic there. That's not to say that there's nothing interesting to be found by using UV light. But yeah, I have had a little peek, and it was singularly uninteresting, unfortunately. But well worth a look.
That makes logical sense, because obviously, apart from day flying moths, there isn't going to be very much UV around at night time. So makes a lot of sense. But sometimes, you know, insects have various structures that sometimes fluoresce under UV. They may not have evolved as signals in any way, but you know, I just wonder whether there may be things out there. Wouldn't it be great if we could do uncertain and rustic just by shining one of those banknote detectors on, for example? He said again.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I even tried looking at the scales of them under very high magnification.
Yeah,
because there is did you find any real difference? Because I couldn't find anything.
I sort of thought I could, but then I ran the specimens past Adrian and he said no. So I don't know. I can't tell.
Alan,
There's got to be a difference, because if what people we're on to next month again, aren't we? I mean, if what people say about the sheen is true, surely the scales have to have a different structure. But anyway, let's come back to this next month. Let's talk about the dark swordgrass. Poor Anne.
Well, I was just going to say, with the fact that with the COVID-19, people are using less and less notes, those machines might become redundant. You might get one for free to try out.
You can buy them for about $5 on eBay anyway. They're really cheap. But, you know, they're not expensive. So no, I just wondered.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. One of the things that COVID-19 is doing, it's generating some what you might call false UV light sources, because there's unsubstantiated stories. Oh yeah, you can sterilize a whole room with a germicidal lamp. Well, I think you'll find that if you buy some of these lamps, they've actually just got blue LEDs in. There's nothing ultraviolet about them. But where this is going, of course, is that up until COVID-19, the only people buying sort of general purpose UV lamps were people running discos and, you know, mothy people, and, you know, some very restricted applications. So if you're trying to buy lights for your moth trap, you have to be a little bit more careful at the moment. But I noticed that the price of a daylight white photographic bulb, which was equivalent to, I think it was 150 watts, was now down to 18 quid. So I thought, oh, I'll try that in my Robinson moth trap. Don't waste your money. It illuminated the garden and the neighbors' houses and the trees beautifully. But as a moth trap attractant, it was rubbish. It's going to end up as a light in the garage, but it's only 40 watts, you see, so it runs really cool. So it was quite attractive. So I've replaced it now with a WEM light, which is a 20 watt light. There's also some 13 watts, very similar bulbs made by another manufacturer, and they work so much better. So if you're getting bored making your moth trap, the best bulbs I found so far are, you know, that aren't high wattage and mercury vapor, are the WEM lights. And where this is going is that they're all characterized by being very bright in the soft UV range. So that's quite interesting, which then comes all the way back to what you were saying, Alan, that the moths can obviously see very well in the near UV. So you kind of think, well, why can't they, or why haven't they got markings that can be perceived in the near UV? And the answer is, I don't know, or maybe just nobody found them yet.
Because there's no UV light at night, or very little, I would think.
Yeah, or maybe they actually use it to help them to find places to roost during the day. So what they try to do is get out of it.
Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe it's camouflage during the daytime rather than sexual selection or anything else at night. Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 There's an interesting. Sorry, I'm going to talk about spiders. My apologies. There's an interesting thing about crab spiders, which are the ones that tend to sit on flowers and do change colour to match the colour of the flower. And it was always assumed that they did it to be that their object was to be as invisible as possible. It turns out that in UV light and the sort of thing that a bee can see, they look like a landing strip. They've actually got sort of flower attractant type markings to sort of lure the bees in, rather than. But again, they're only in the UV. So yeah, these things can be worth investigating sometimes. Is there anybody else who wants to raise anything or had anything interesting in their moth trap recently? I was assuming you've been able to run a moth trap with the weather we've been having. I think you're muted, Dave.
No, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, Alan, is it possible to ask a question or two about microscopes today?
Yeah, I guess, unless there's any moth questions, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, the moth questions might stem from your answers, I guess. But yeah, I was talking to Brunel about a microscope and one of their, Apex range, and I seem to have found the one that looked the most interesting, but then discovered that the various camera attachments couldn't accommodate a Lumix TZ60. The standard sort of point and shoot. Yeah, because of the extendable lens.
Right. Yeah.
Well, they said the field of view would be so small as to be sort of useless. I think was that another comment.
That can be a problem with zoom lenses and some of the compact cameras. I've certainly taken pictures. I think during the last Microscope Club, again, the recording of that is available. There were some pictures of Philodroma spider I took using a TZ60, just holding it to the eyepiece of the microscope. There are some caveats about that. You need to be quite careful to make sure it's centered. And there are all sorts of gizmos and setups that you can see online where people have used various cardboard tubes and plumbing accessories and tape and all kinds of things to make their own adapters. I mean, it's certainly doable. But maybe that's the kind of level of detail we should save for Microscope Club next week.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, you could ask about that. Okay.
Oh, and well, okay. If you're still open for questions, where can we get hold of some CO2 to subdue the moths?
And an applicator.
That's what you're looking.
Yeah.
Hang on. What I'm going to do is post you a link. I'm going to look in my eBay account, and not eBay, Amazon account, and I shall post you the link. So what I'm just held up there was basically a bicycle pump. So if I go into my orders,
yeah, that's
While you're just finding that, Paul, let me just share this with you. So this isn't a recommendation for this particular seller or anything else, but this is what I use. This is a Sparklets Corkmaster. And this takes these little CO2, let me get a big picture. This takes these little CO2 cylinders that you can buy. This is what I use. This one is, I have to say, this one is relatively expensive. This is 18 quid. I think I paid about a fiver for mine. So they are available. Paul's got this, is it a bicycle pump or a football inflator that Paul uses? He'll show you what he uses.
Yeah, it's, hang on a moment, you're changing screen. The system's rather badly behaved at the moment. It keeps taking control.
Sparklet's Corkmaster.
Yeah.
They're harder to get hold of. So what I did was, now I'm one of these people, I have lots of screens open on my desktop, you see. Where's the chat window again? So here it is. And then finally, if you follow a link with that, you can get the CO2 cylinders that go with it as well. Carbon by box.
Yeah, because I saw one of those injection ones, but I think they were all from America.
Yeah. So I have to say, I'm finding it brilliantly. So it works brilliantly. So CO2. Can't find the link at the moment. Oh, here we are. Got it. These are the ones that go with it. So just about to post the last link.
I've just had a quick look on Amazon, and there are lots and lots of different CO2 powered inflators of various kinds and various prices. There's all sorts of things there. Obviously you need something with a valve on it so you can just give it a little squirt rather than release the whole of the cylinder.
I'm going to hold it up at the moment. What you've got to be careful is that if you push your finger too hard, I mean, everything's flying across the room and you can literally blow the wings off a moth. So what you have to do is very carefully get it to give a little hiss. And I'm finding it absolutely brilliant because for a lot of the moths that I bring in, I just pop them in here, give a little whiff of CO2.
So he's put that on.
Yeah, and then you can, it stuns them for maybe 30 seconds. And if I've got my microscope set up or magnifiers, I've got all sorts of magnifiers here, I can have a quick look at the feature that I want and pop it back in, because the vast majority of things get let go. And then if I'm actually going to kill it, these days I always stun it in CO2 first before putting it in the killing jar, because then it doesn't thrash around, so it does less damage to itself. And then my final procedure after setting, I always put things in the freezer to make sure they're completely killed as well. So I these days I use 3 stages. First, stun them with CO2, and then I'll often photograph them at that stage as well. But they recover so quickly that they can suddenly shake it off, zoom, and straight out the window. You've got to be careful there. I think I might get myself one of those little tents to stop them doing that. And then if I'm going to retain it, it then goes in the killing jar, and then finally, after it's set, I do this all at the same time. It then goes in the freezer. But the CO2 is the vast majority of stuff that you can let go, because you can just see the features that you need to really easily.
True.
Because this recording is going to go on eBay, we should probably say that in the vast majority of cases, there's no need to kill them off. If you just give it a little whiff of CO2, wait for it to stop moving, and then you've got a minute or so when you can photograph it or look at the underwing or look at whatever details you want to look at. And then the moth will recover and be completely unharmed and will happily fly off. It's just worth adding that.
I would totally agree with that. It does sidestep the issue.
With the proviso that in some circumstances there are species of moth, this is just for the benefit of the recording, there are some species of moth that can only be determined by dissection. There's no other reliable way apart from DNA to identify them. If we're ever going to get scientific data on whether these species are increasing or declining, then the only way to do that is to take 1 or 2 specimens to know exactly what you've got. But generally, people have the wrong idea about moth trapping. It doesn't mean, it's not moth trapping in the sense of let's kill all the moths. It's just let's have a look at them and see what's there.
Many thanks for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, needed to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, guys, another thing that's worth trying in the garden, because you got few opportunities to go elsewhere, is sugaring. I mean, I occasionally try it in the garden. Just use black treacle, and on the right nights, the best nights are when really just before a thunderstorm starts, but it doesn't actually rain. So you get that lovely, still, warm, humid night. Warmth is key. You don't want any real wind, but maybe just enough to get the vapors, from the sugar mix going, blowing around. Even in a garden, that can be really productive, and it will bring in different moths to the moths that you get in the moth trap. So those of you who are trying to get both of the copper underwings later in the year and find old lady moths, and the red underwings, they come really, really well to sugar in a way that they don't come to the moth trap. Yeah, you get a few copper underwings in the moth trap, we all do, but they come in large numbers to the sugar, even in gardens.
And it's coming to the time of year now where sugaring is effective. It's not effective all year round so much, but certainly this time of year, it's a good time to try it. Mark Skevington was doing some very interesting things last year. That's, I think everyone should have a go at. If you're anything like me, you may have been finding that the fruit and veg in the supermarket is quite short dated at the moment. And so we all wind up with the odd peach that's gone moldy on one side, or a banana which is overripe. I don't understand that notion. There's no such thing as an overripe banana as far as I'm concerned, but other people don't agree with that. What Mark was doing is, when you've got a piece of moldy fruit, don't throw it away, hang it off a tree in your garden. And with a banana, I know what he was doing was cutting a window out of the peel, because if you just put the banana out, it literally disintegrates and runs down the tree by the time it's ripe from a moth's perspective. But if you cut a little window in the peel with a sharp knife, and then you can hang it off the tree, you've got a week's worth of entertainment there from food that would otherwise have gone in the bin. So it's something that you can just go out with a little torch and a little compact camera, and on a warm, still night, as Paul said, it will be swarming with moths.
Yeah.
During the day, of course, you'll get wasps.
That is a great tip, Alan. I might try that. I don't think I'm very good at moth traps or anything, but I might try that.
Don't ever throw away moldy fruit.
Yeah.
Use it for
A closely related idea, which comes from Victorian times, is to actually put the mushy bananas and fruit and some black treacle and stuff actually in a sock, and you hang a sock up. And where the idea is here as well is that they used to have regular patches. In fact, there was a custom that they put their calling card on your sugaring patches. And if you wander around at night, like I do sometimes, you realize that when we see moths near moth traps, they're flying very erratically. And that's because their normal behavior is disrupted by the light. But actually, in very low light, you see them, they fly around, they hover, they're looking around at flowers and food sources. And they do get habituated to regular sources of food. So that if you were to sugar the same patches in your garden, again, this all depends on your own garden, your own circumstances, or hang a sock up, but keep it going for a long time, you may well find, just as the Victorians did, that the results improve over time. And again, if you read some of the historical articles about sugaring, you'll find that, I can't quote the source, but I've got a reference for it, that it used to be thought that sugaring didn't work in America. But when some experienced UK entomologists went over and showed, basically applied UK know-how to the American terrain, they found, yes, it did work. What it was that a lot of the techniques for making sugaring work had been forgotten. And I think we're in the same sort of situation today, that sugaring actually works very well, but we're so used to the ease of light traps that we kind of forget. And it's a very, very I suppose, invasive way of doing it. You're really just putting food for the moths, like you're putting out food for the birds as well. But it really is worth doing.
If we're going to do Uncertain Rustic in July, can we maybe book sugaring for August for a topic?
Yeah.
Yes, good idea.
Yeah, the best recipes,
Oh, Paul's got a secret recipe. He won't share that with you.
Oh, yes. Now my Christmas puddings, you see. So I've made big batches of sugar, which is basically black treacle, which is equivalent to molasses, really cheap red wine. We use cheap red wine in cooking. And then a muscovado sugar, and I dissolve as much sugar as will go into this mixture. But then what I also do is, when I want to make some baited traps, I get the really, really cheap mixed fruit that you can buy from all good stores, and I marinate this dried fruit in the sugar mixture for a year or so. And then I sometimes put out little jars of this lovely mixture. But at Christmas, when I'm making Christmas puddings, and I make them to a traditional Mrs. B's recipe, I use something very closely based to her plum pudding recipe. I put in the marinated fruit, with the moth sugar in. And everybody who tastes these Christmas puddings basically says, "Wow, that's the best Christmas pudding ever." So that's what you do with your moth sugar.
I'm sure you've.
Also, the longer you keep the sugar, the better it gets as well.
I'm sure you've done all the appropriate risk assessments on that. Okay, we're
diabetes very quickly if you eat too much.
We're coming up for the hour, so I'm going to stop the recording now. Hopefully, there will be future sessions in the months to come, and hopefully you'll join us for some of those and the other Nature Spot events. So thanks once again to Paul for telling us about the dark swordgrass, and we look forward to future recordings.